Okay, so that brings us to attributions. An attribution is a judgment about the cause of why someone did something. And there are two different types. The first is called dispositional attribution, or in other words, assigning that cause of a person's behavior to their own personal qualities or characteristics, their own disposition as a person. So this is saying that it's something about who they are that they did what they did. And you can contrast that with situational attribution, which is assigning a person's behavior to the environmental causes. The situation around them is why they did what they did. So some examples from, this kind of intro activities. If you were to use dispositional attributions to explain those behaviors, you might say someone cuts you off in traffic because they're a rude person or they're impatient. Maybe someone is late to class because they are a lazy person. They don't care about school. Or they ate someone's food in the fridge because they're selfish. So assigning adjectives to a person is a dispositional attribution. Whereas you also might have said reasons like this. Maybe you or someone else cut someone off in traffic because they were driving to a hospital, they were in a hurry, they were going to a loved one. Things that, the environment around them caused them to do what they do. Maybe they were late to class because their car didn't start, or their alarm didn't go off, or things around them didn't happen. And lastly, maybe they ate someone's food accidentally because they put them in similar containers, something to that effect where it's not them, it's the situation. So just as a Bitmoji way of remembering those things, dispositional is like someone's mean, and then situational is like, yeah, it's life. I had no control over it. So we're going to keep these in mind as we talk more about attributions. So you may be wondering, do we do this fairly? And no, of course we don't. There are tons of biases in how we attribute causes to people's behaviors. And you might have noticed that as you were comparing someone else doing these behaviors compared to when you were doing these behaviors. So we're going to walk through 3 different types of attribution biases. Starting off with correspondence bias. So this is the tendency to view a behavior as a result of disposition, as a result of who that person is, even when the behavior could be explained maybe better by the situation, by the environment. So for instance, again, I'm going to return to COVID and pandemic as my example because it's just social psych written all over it. So let's pretend we're back into when restaurants first started to open up. So you're allowed to sit outdoors, but there was a general advisory to wear masks at all times, right, when you're out in public. So let's say you see these groups of people and they're outside, they're in public, and they're not wearing masks. What's your first thought? Why do you think they're not wearing masks? Not gonna lie, when I see people out in public not wearing masks, it immediately triggers this dispositional attribution. They don't care about other people. They don't care about science. They don't, they don't want to wear a piece of fabric to help someone else potentially not catch COVID. Like I immediately go to that is a personal characteristic and they're making that choice, right? However, you then stop to think, okay, wait, they're eating a meal at a restaurant. You can't physically eat a meal wearing a mask. So maybe it's not they don't actually, not care about other people. It might just be the situation they're in doesn't make sense to wear a mask in, right? So this is, I exhibit correspondence bias here, where I'm viewing them as a reason about who they are as a person and not about the situation that they're in. The reason this happens is from a pretty fancy phrase called the fundamental attribution error. This is a phrase you're going to hear all the time, so I'd write this down. It's the failure to consider these environmental situational variables when you make attributions. So it leads you to making more attributions about that person's character, about that person's disposition instead. So I like this meme that's like, I can't tell if they're actually a rude person or if I'm just thinking everything is a dispositional attribution instead. They're pretty similar things. Correspondence bias is like the phenomenon, the tendency, whereas fundamental attribution error is more why it happens, why people have that bias. But yeah, this is a good thing to kind of know. We make these errors all the time. Second bias, actor-observer bias. So this was like the intro example. This is when you have different opinions depending on whether you're the actor in a scenario or the observer in a scenario. So you emphasize dispositional or characteristics about a person to explain other people's behavior, but you emphasize situation when you're explaining your own behavior. So if you notice differences in your examples about why you cut someone off in traffic or whatnot, you might be exhibiting actor-observer bias. So for instance, when someone else litters, you might be like, wow, they're so inconsiderate. They don't care about the environment. But when you litter, you're like, well, I didn't have a trash can. Like I couldn't throw it away, right? So again, returning back to our code example, let's say we're talking about not wearing a mask in public. So someone does not have a mask on. If that's you, if you didn't wear a mask and someone's like, why aren't you wearing a mask? You might be like, oh, I forgot my mask at home. Like it's a situation, I don't have it on me. I would, but it's something in the situation prohibited me from doing it. Or I'm eating at a restaurant, that type of thing. Whereas if you're observing it, you might be like, wow, they don't care about other people. That's a them thing. They're making that choice, right? So this is changing the way you view the same situation depending on whether you're doing it or whether someone else is doing it. And then lastly, we're going to talk about self-serving bias. So this is all about you. This is the tendency to view your successes differently than your failures. More specifically, when you succeed, when you do something, you use a dispositional attribution. You're like, well, of course I got an A on that test. I'm smart, or I did great. Whereas if you didn't do so well on that test, you wouldn't say like, oh, I'm dumb. You would say like, oh man, that test was hard. The universe was against me. The teacher doesn't like me, that type of thing, right? So good things are all about you. Bad things you blame on the environment. So this type of thing, I just used that same exact example accidentally. So yeah, just taking credit for positive events and blaming external factors for negative events. And then returning back to our COVID example again, let's say our example here is you did not catch COVID. You avoided getting COVID. So you might say that as a success, I didn't contract COVID because I'm smart. I wore a mask, I followed directions, I did all the things, I social distanced, I, right? Whereas say you did contract COVID, you might say like, oh, well, it's just that my friends didn't tell me they were positive. It was my roommate who got it and she spread it to me. Our officials didn't shut down quick enough. Our officials didn't put mask mandates quick enough. Other people, others, right? So again, you attribute successes to yourself and failures on other people. So those are the three main biases we're going to talk about. So let's try it. So I have 4 scenarios here, and I want you to guess what the bias is in these 4 scenarios. I'll put them down below.